Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest Asian Carp Canada webinar. My name is Rebecca, and I work on the Asian Carp project at the Invasive Species Center. This afternoon, we're joined by 4 speakers. First, we'll have Dr. Doran Mason, Dr. Ed Rutherford, and Dr. Hanyan Zhang to talk to us about their work on modeling the potential effects of bighead and silver carp on Great Lakes food webs. And then after that, we'll have Jenny Apriesnig to speak to us on the economic impacts of Asian carp to the Great Lakes. So just a little bit about our speakers. We have Ed Rutherford, who is a research fishery biologist at NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He's also an adjunct research scientist at the University of Michigan, and his research includes population dynamics, early life history, and habitat of Great Lakes and marine fishes. Then we have Dr. Doran Mason, who is also a research ecologist at NOAA, and his specialty is quantitative aquatic ecology. Then we have Dr. Hanyan Zhang, who is an assistant research scientist and assisted in the modeling work for this study, actually did it. And then we have Jenny Apriesnig, who is a PhD candidate at Colorado State University in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics, where she develops models to examine fisheries and invasive species issues. So following the webinar presentations, we'll have some time for questions. So if at any time you have any, please type them in the question box throughout, and when the speakers are finished, they'll do their best to answer them. So Ed and Doran and Hanyan, you guys can take it from here.
Thank you, Rebecca. This is Doran. I'll be speaking first. And I just want to state right off the bat, I mean, it is certainly an honor and privilege to be able to talk to you today and share with you some of our modeling results on Asian carp impacts in the Great Lakes. Before heading into this presentation, I do want to acknowledge a lot of our colleagues and sponsors for this research that we're going to be presenting. And the fact that on this title slide, you only see 4 names, but this represents a lot of work from a lot of individuals. So I just basically want to also acknowledge those individuals that have contributed this work. So when we think about Asian carp, specifically in the Great Lakes region, we typically think of 4 different species: the black carp, the grass carp, bighead carp, and silver carp. Blackhead carp feed on mollusks, bivalves, and are currently found in the Mississippi River. Grass carp we find scattered through the Great Lakes, and there's recent evidence suggests they might be reproducing in Lake Erie. But what we're going to focus on today is the bighead carp and the silver carp. So apologies to all our Canadian colleagues, but this is just a summary slide of some of the work on in the U.S. side on Asian carp. There has been a substantial amount of work in the Mississippi River system that's focused on their reproduction, their reproductive capacity, their population dynamics. In particular, also looking at some of the impact on native species within the Mississippi River system, and also issues of how do you actually control the population. In the Great Lakes, some recent studies have been to identify potential pathways, identify suitable spawning habitats and tributaries within the Great Lakes Basin. Also use of environmental DNA to be able to detect if Asian carp are actually in the system, which involves taking a water sample and looking for Asian carp DNA in the water sample. Some bioenergetics models that looks at the physiology, metabolism of these fishes, and estimate and predict how much they might be able to consume in terms of phytoplankton and zooplankton, their primary prey. But here we're going to focus on the work that we've been doing on ecosystem level models that deal with ecopath ecosystem, which is a food web model, individual based model, and then a full-blown Atlantis ecosystem model. And we'll touch on each of these in different details through the presentation. So, Asian carp, where did they come from? Back in the early 1970s, they were brought in and stocked aquaculture ponds in Arkansas. And it's believed that in the early 1990s, there was a big flooding event in some of these aquaculture facilities where some Asian carp escaped and got into the Mississippi River system. Where since that time, since the early 1990s, it was spreading northward and increasing in abundance. So why do we perceive them as a threat? These fish grow very large. It can have a maximum weight of about 100 pounds and exceed 4 feet in length. They can consume equivalent 40% of the body weight. Now think about that. Think about if we could consume 40% of our body weight. So let's take an average 200-pound man. That'll represent eating 80 pounds of food a day. And they also, especially given their size, they're very, very fecund. They can reproduce very rapidly. They produce a lot of eggs, and they have the ability to then establish themselves pretty quickly in a new system. So they are clearly a threat in the Great Lakes. And partly and mostly this is because they feed primarily on the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, the base of the food web, which feeds the prey fish, which then those prey fish feed those recreational fish species that we hold in high regard. So, for example, in Lake Ontario, Lake Michigan, this could be the salmonids. In Lake Erie, the walleye. And they actually have different dietary patterns. Silver carp tend to feed more on the phytoplankton, while bighead carp tend to feed more on the zooplankton. So I sort of alluded to this earlier. Our approach is a multi-modeling approach across different lakes and different levels of productivity. So like I mentioned before, we'll present today a little bit about individual-based bioenergetics community model, and we'll define that in a little bit. Ed will be talking about that. I'll be continuing, and I'll talk about the food web modeling approach that we use for several of the Great Lakes. And then Hong Yang will also then talk about our true ecosystem model, the Atlantis modeling framework. We've been modeling, we have modeled and continue to model and will be modeling various lakes, including Lake Erie, Lake Michigan. This includes the main basin of Lake Michigan, but also some of the productive embayments, such as Muskegon Lake and Green Bay. This is also true of Lake Huron, modeling the main basin of Lake Huron, and also the very productive Saginaw Bay, and also working with colleagues from Canada, modeling some of Lake Ontario. So I'm going to talk about the ecopathic ecosystem modeling approach, which is a food web model. It's a very complex model. So what I want you to take away from this slide, one, with all those round circles and lines that connect those circles, that's a complex food web, going from the very base with the phytoplankton up to the zooplankton, to prey fishes, and then to piscivores. This food web model can be driven by nutrient loading, and we do a little bit there. And also, we can use fisheries harvest as another means to force the model. Now, what makes this unique from other approaches using this food web approach is we've incorporated uncertainty in our estimates of parameters, and particularly for the Asian carp. Since Asian carp don't live in the Great Lakes right now, aren't established in the Great Lakes, we really don't have a good feel for what the values for the parameters within the food web model should be. So what we did was we did a structured expert judgment analysis, which brought together 11 individuals with expertise in Great Lakes fisheries, as well as expertise in Asian carp. And we asked them a lot of questions. So such questions is, if Asian carp were in the Great Lakes, what predators would feed upon them? How productive do you think the Asian carp would be once they're in the Great Lakes? What's the highest sustained biomass do you think they can achieve? So we use all this information, asking these questions to each one of our experts, and we developed essentially some sort of probability distribution, which we sampled from. And it creates our ability to look at the uncertainty about our estimates in terms of the outputs of the model. The other thing that is really interesting, and Jenny will be talking about this later, is we've also linked economic models to our food web model output. So not only are we looking at the ecological effects of Asian carp on the Great Lakes food web, but actually also looking at what are the economic consequences and the changes within the food web. So now I'm going to start on Lake Erie, and I'll go through a couple of other lakes after Lake Erie. But Lake Erie is, when you look at all 5 of the Great Lakes, the most productive of the Great Lakes. This will become important in a little bit. So when we run our model and everything else, the first thing we're looking at and asking the question, what would be the maximum or equilibrium biomass Asian carp would be able to achieve, in this case, in Lake Erie? What we have here is a graph. We ran these food web model scenarios for over 100 years. And you see that on the horizontal line it says decades. And then on the vertical axis is biomass in kilograms per hectare. And what you see is, one, I think a nice blue color graph. The second, and that really stands out, is our ability to incorporate the uncertainty in our parameter estimates within the food web. And then the Asian carp, based on our model runs, would reach a mean equilibrium biomass of about 60 kilograms per hectare. And then it could possibly achieve up to a maximum 150 kilograms per hectare. So we've incorporated the uncertainty within our estimates. The second thing I want to point out is Asian carp were added to the food web at decade number 2, so 20 years after we started running the model scenario. And then it only took them an additional 10 years to establish themselves and reach equilibrium biomass within 20 years. So what does this mean? We're not going to show all the detailed information, but there are some stand-alone messages that at times were quite surprising when we saw this and interesting. One is that Asian carp can make up 1/3 of the total fish biomass within Lake Erie. And that's demonstrated in that pie chart there, where the dark blue is Asian carp biomass and the light blue is the rest of the fish. So this is 1 kilogram of Asian carp for every 3 kilograms of all the other fish within the lake. The other thing is, and these we just pulled out some various components of the food web, is for the most part, Asian carp are going to have negative effects on most fish species and zooplankton. And you can see this in this graph. What we see are the several species going horizontally with the bar charts. And then we have on the vertical axis something called change from baseline. This is percent change from baseline, where we ran a baseline simulation that did not include Asian carp. Then we added Asian carp, and then we look at percent change in biomass of these species. And what you can see is walleye could be negatively affected. Yellow perch, maybe not so much. But the planktivores, such as gizzardshad and emerald shiner, the model predicts that they would have a big impact on those species, as well as some of the zooplankton species, such as cladocerans and predaceous cladocerans. Something that came out that was a surprise to us was smallmouth bass, in that there appears to be a net benefit for smallmouth bass. And this is likely to do that smallmouth bass are capable of consuming the juvenile Asian carp within the system, so providing a net positive benefit. So then we took the food web model that I just showed you for Lake Erie, and then we have model simulations for the main basin of Lake Huron, Saginaw Bay Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan. And then we compared our model results across these 3 systems. And I wanted to note here that these three systems differ in levels of productivity, where Lake Erie and Saginaw Bay are very productive systems, whereas the open waters of Lake Huron and Lake Michigan are far less productive. So what's the prediction from our models, our food web models for equilibrium biomass of Asian carp across these three systems? Again, on the bottom, you see LE is Lake Erie, there's Saginaw Bay, Lake Huron, the major basin, basically open water, and Lake Michigan, the open water. And then we have Asian carp biomass in kilograms per hectare. And it immediately stands out that the more productive systems, Lake Erie and Saginaw Bay, would support more Asian carp than Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. So if we start working up the food web and look at the plankton response, that being phytoplankton, zooplankton, and certain components of the microbial food web, we get something like this. We have Lake Huron in blue, Saginaw Bay in red, Lake Erie in green, and Lake Michigan in purple. And across the bottom, we have nauplii, rotifers, which are small plankton, protozoa and bacteria, which are part of the microbial food web. Phyta is inedible phytoplankton, and you can think of these as blue-green algae, and then edible phytoplankton. Some things stand out. There doesn't seem to be much effect on nauplii from Asian carp. Rotifers seem to be negatively impacted in the more productive systems, such as Saginaw Bay and Lake Erie. But then we have some positive effects on protozoa in the very productive Saginaw Bay. Yet we don't, and also in Lake Erie. Then we see bacteria being significantly negative impacted within Lake Erie. Inedible phytoplankton. Now remember, these are the blue-greens. These are the nasty buggers. And in Saginaw Bay, Asian carp seem to have a big impact on these inedible phytoplankton. Whereas in Saginaw Bay, there seems to be a net positive benefit for the edible phytoplankton. As we work up, now we look at the planktivore response. These are RBS stands for rainbow smelts. And then across, we have white perch, alewife, gizzard shad, emerald shiner, round goby, cladocerans, predation cladocerans, regular cladocerans, and copepods. Overwhelmingly, we see two patterns. Pretty much all a negative impact on these planktivorous fishes. And the greatest impact appears on these planktivorous fishes that are in Saginaw Bay, Lake Erie, the more productive of the four systems that we've modeled. And then if we look at the piscivore response, in general, we see a general pattern of negative effects for example, Chinook, lake trout, burbot, walleye as well, and some positive impact for adult yellow perch. So these percentages, for the most part, might seem big and significant, but when you consider just the change in the biomass, these are actually nominal changes in changes in the biomass of these fish species. So I just want to wrap up and just some summary and conclusions, just general conclusions, that Asian carp negatively impact cladocerans and other zooplankton species, planktivores, and most piscivores. But there are some positive benefits for other piscivores, such as smallmouth bass, where they may have the ability to actually prey upon the juvenile life stage of the Asian carp. And Asian carp impacts vary across lakes and habitats, but are again mainly negative on plankton, planktivores. But they're neutral for the benthivores, those species of fish that are feeding on the organisms that live on the bottom of the lake. But one of the key general conclusions is habitat matters. The productivity of the lake matters. So the more productive systems, such as Lake Erie and Saginaw Bay, we would expect to see the greatest negative impact on some of the biota. And as you go to more oligotrophic systems such as Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, then we expect there be less of an impact. So when we consider the effects of Asian carp on the Great Lakes in general, we have to take into consideration the productivity of each one of the individual lakes. So that concludes my part of the presentation. So Dr. Hongyan Zhang will now present some of our Atlantis ecosystem modeling work.
Thank you, Doran. We already see the habitat matters. We want so the previous model just a box model. So to study how different habitat productivity are affected by the Asian carp, we adopted a food web ecosystem model with three-dimensional spatial resolution, which is Atlantis ecosystem model, which is developed by Dr. Fulton at Australia. This is a very complex model, although it provides more detail in population dynamics and spatial resolution. It does require a lot of effort and time. We have been working on this model for quite a long time, and now the results we present still considering like preliminary. We still need to dig more about and understanding why the results similar or different from the EcoPath with ecosystem model. Specifically, this model has three submodels. From bottom to the top, it has a hydrographic submodel, which take the output from hydrodynamics model, including flow field and water temperature and light condition. And those as input to drive the biogeochemistry submodule to simulate the nutrient dynamics, including phosphorus, nitrogen, and silicon. And in the ecological submodule, we have a full web, food web, including from bacteria up to fish. We have 15 fish species, in addition to 2 Asian carp species, bighead carp and silver carp. For these vertebrate groups in the Atlantis, we simulate with age structure each year as one group. Most of those groups are simulated as biomass pool, but it does track the abundance and biomass for each fish group. The top economic, social, and economic submodule simulate the dynamics of different fisheries and how they affect the fish population dynamics. But for our study, we haven't got that far, so we just use fisheries catch as an external forcing that affect the food web dynamics. Oops. Welcome to ahead. Oh. Okay. So we have been applied this model to Lake Michigan and Lake Erie and Lake Huron, but each lake has different steps right now. For Lake Michigan, we calibrated and has some preliminary results. For Lake Erie, we have been set up, but we need to continue calibrate that model. And for Lake Huron, we only configure the model domain. So today I just talk about our study using the model on Lake Michigan. This slide shows the vertical and horizontal spatial resolution. Horizontally, we divided Lake Michigan into 35 polygons. the polygons defined based on the bathymetry and fisheries management unit. We have nearshore polygons and offshore polygons, and also very deep water area polygons. And we also take the nutrient loads from the tributaries. And vertically, the model can divide the water column into strata with different thickness. So at the top, we have fine vertical resolution, 10 meter each, from 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. And then from 40 to 60 at one layer, and then the whole layer is greater than 6 meter deep. We did this according to the vertical profile of temperature and chlorophyll distribution over the summer stratification period. So we calibrate this model, mainly compare the model output biomass with the observations for about 14 fish groups and some zooplankton and algae biomass at different sapling station for their vertical distribution and the seasonal distribution. But I don't have those slides here today, so you have to trust me. But I think the model you are working on it, you always, I will take the calibration as a continuing process. It can be calibrated for the observation biomass. Also, we'll calibrate with the process rates, like the production rates and consumption rates, and also compare the individual size with observation. So there are many levels and details about the calibration. But this is the preliminary results when I calibrate the model and then put Asian carp in with a very small amount and let it go. The setup is very similar to EcoPath EcoSim model, but one parameter was different. In the EcoPath EcoSim model, it has a vulnerability term that defines how much the prey available to Asian carp. But in the Atlantis, it has a different parameter, which is similar, but it called the prey prophorus. It catches it differently. I think that might contribute to the difference of final Asian carp biomass between those two models. For example, here the Asian carp, the big-headed carp and the silver carp reached to high biomass level at about 100 years after the initial simulation year, and the combined biomass could be as high as 50. And it's for the silver carp, the population start to grow quickly at about 25 years, while the big-headed carp take a much longer time to start up. And it sounds like the population is still growing. Also, although the rate is slowed down, tend to be level off. So one way I need to run it longer. The other reason is I use the external forcing repeatedly, but different external forcing has different length of period. So when I use it, the combination will be different every year. Okay, so this is the impact of Asian carp, which just the biomass of those groups compared to without Asian carp at the end of simulation year. I think I averaged the biomass of the last 10 simulation years. So very similar to the EcoPath EcoSim results. We have seen the negative impact on the preyfish, alewife, and the rainbow smelt, and some of the pathways, chinook, and lake trout, and yellow perch increased slightly. That can be, we still try to figure out the detail why it is happening. And the bathytrophy decreased, and while the green algae and the carp increased. The carp increased because the bathytrophy has a very high predation mortality on copperpod. So that contributes, the final results show the carp increase. But still, we are still using, investigating this model and try to figure out what the result or the reason under the results. We are not very clear yet. Okay, that's about Atlantis model. I give it to Ed for the IBM model.
So this is Ed, and those were two different types of models that we're using. The reason that we're using three different types of models is that if we get a similar direction of response of the food web to Asian carp using models with different assumptions about spatial resolution and about how carp are predicted to grow, and we feel more confident in our overall response about the effect of Asian carp on the food web. This is the third type of model, and I will actually just introduce the model, and then since we're running short on time, I will then switch over to Jenny Apriesnig, who's going to talk about the economic effects of Asian carp. So this model, in different than the other two models, actually tracks the daily movements of individual fish in a habitat. And so what you're looking at is a simulated habitat of Saginaw Bay with shallow inshore habitats in red and deeper offshore habitats depicted in green, with little squares there that depict model boxes in which the movements and growth and survival of individual fish occur. And the life cycle of the fish that's tracked for an individual each day is shown here. And basically they're moving and consuming and growing in response to temperature that, based on data from Saginaw Bay, they are allowed to eat pools of prey, and then they are tracked to follow their growth. During the springtime, they move up into rivers to spawn, and then move back out again. So in this model, we are tracking different types of prey group response to Asian carp: phytoplankton, zooplankton, benthos, quagga mussels, an example of a forage fish, and detritus, which is organic carbon in the system. And those are all represented by biomass pools. We're actually measuring individuals in the model for walleye, yellow perch, brown goby, rainbow smelt, and silver and bighead carp. And this represents the interactions in the model. Note that the boxes in gray are modeled as biomass pools, while the boxes in white are modeled as individual fish. The dotted lines indicate interactions between the biomass pools. So spiny water flea are feeding on zooplankton, for example, but they are also fed on by forage fish. The gray solid lines indicate interactions between the biomass pools and individual fish species. And the black solid lines indicate predator-prey interactions between populations of individual fish. So, for example, rainbow smelt and yellow perch serve as prey for walleye. And so again, like with the other models, we run these scenarios looking at different beginning numbers of Asian carp, from none to just 10 individuals to starting with 1 million fish, and see how long it takes them to reach the carrying capacity in this environment, and look at the response of the food web. So we have results from this run for Saginaw Bay, but I'm not going to, in the interest of time, and probably interest of the audience, we'll switch over to Jenny Apriesnig to look at the economic response to the Asian carp potential invasion in Lake Erie, I believe.
All right, thank you. I appreciate you having me here today. And again, I want to say thank you. I've been able to work with these great collaborators. I'm just one of a team representing the econ side of things. Okay, so what I want to talk about today, I'll focus a little bit on results, but more so I'm going to focus on some of the modeling approaches that we have taken to integrate this idea of ecological and economic impacts from Asian carp. There are a variety of economic models out there, even within our team, of how we're going to approach these systems. So we think about the impact of invasive species on present species. We also need to consider how a fishery is managed. We need to think about how proposed policies, whether those policies be prevention or control, will impact the fishery, which would include those species, but also the human impacts such as employment and other sectors in the economy. And then we also look at and think about this idea of how do humans and the ecosystem adapt to changing conditions. And then another way that this idea is approached differently is through the time frame, and if we're looking at discrete versus continuous movements. And so these are all things that we consider when we're building these models, and they are addressed in a variety of ways. For today, I'm just going to present two approaches that we've taken and two approaches I've been the most involved with. Some examples of our applications, some of the things that we have looked at are the impacts of a Lake Erie Asian carp invasion that very much related and uses some of these outputs that Ed, Doran, and Hong have discussed. We've also looked at impacts of changes in shipping policy on the Great Lakes regional economy. So that would be saying if we're going to change the way that ballast water, for example, is managed, or if we're going to close the water system in Chicago, what kind of impacts would those have? So that's looking at the policy side of things. So how would we adapt to changes in policies? And then we've also looked at impacts of multiple, or I should say different invasive species on the Lake Michigan regional economy. So the key parts of all of these are that all of the models, we build them to include some interaction between either a policy change or the ecological inputs and human choices. So we're trying to get at those interactions between the two. When we're developing these integrated models, I think there's three factors that we need to consider in our analysis and what our goals for these models are. So how environmental changes impact human choice. So how are we going to model that? How changes in the economy, so how human choices impact the environment, and in this case we will be looking at that for fisheries and the food web. And then also, again, how policies impact both of those things, so how we impact the food web and how we would impact the economy. So these are things that we consider when developing our models to integrate these two systems. So kind of diving into maybe a big picture of what we consider, you can think of the flow of the economy as the circular flow between households and producers. We have monetary flow, so households give their money up in order to purchase certain goods. Producers give their money up in order to employ people. So we're going to look at, their labor, capital. Those are the traditional inputs to production that we would normally consider. But then with this type of modeling, we also understand that there are ecosystem services that are related to our production or our consumption of goods. So we have labor and capital, but also the amount of fish in the lake are going to determine how much we can harvest. And so we can see that if we're looking at certain industries within the Great Lakes region, we could have recreational fishing, and commercial fishing are obviously going to be impacted by changes in the fish stock. But we can also look at how other industries in that economy would be impacted as well. And so one of the goals of our modeling is how to best model this connection between the economy and the ecosystem. And so that's, again, a variety of ways to do that, and I'll present you with the two ways that we've gone about it. So I would say for these two models that I'm going to present, there's kind of a different scope. So I just want to talk through that first. So I call one a single link model, and what I mean by that is that there's this environmental or ecological component. So all of those who have already talked help us with this. They develop a food web model. The models I'll be talking about today, we've used the outputs from the EWE analysis, and they're the experts in those fields. They're able to inform us economists of how they think that these species populations are going to change. So we get that percent change, and we can feed that then into our economic component. So introduce that biomass percent change to the econ model. So if the stock of yellow perch changes, what are going to be the impacts of that to our regional economy? So then we can calculate the human response to that environmental or ecological change. So I would call this setup here our single link model. We take output from an ecological model and feed it into the economic model. On the other side of things, I would call this a multi-link model, is when we add this additional feedback. So once we've taken the output from the ecological model, see how humans respond to that change, then we can again feed that back into the ecological model, take it that one step further, and we can keep doing that for as much as we would want. But it's introducing that additional feedback. The ecosystem changes, humans react. How does humans' reaction then again impact further changes in the ecosystem? So I'm going to talk about two model setups then. So the first one here is going to be the single link model. So this is where we used for looking at the impacts of an Asian carp invasion on Lake Erie. So this model, we specifically looked at U.S. counties surrounding Lake Erie. We needed to incorporate in our model that the fishery is, when we're looking at yellow perch, the fishery is managed by a total allowable catch. And then again, commercial fishing of yellow perch depends on that total allowable catch and the stock level. So we use those predicted changes of yellow perch to shock the stock level in the econ model. And the reason we're focusing on yellow perch is we're limited by the availability of data, and then when we're talking about the economy, what's important as far as commercial fishing. On the U.S. side, it's pretty limited, but yellow perch is the one that is the most commercially sought in Lake Erie. And so then we can compare those benchmark values with the simulated scenarios. And so in a model like this, I'm not going to go through all of the details here, but what we're able to see is that, okay, so when Hong Yang tells us that yellow perch is going to maybe increase by a little bit for here, for example, 3.5%, we can look at how that's going to affect the other values in our system. And in this case, this isn't always the case, but in this case, because yellow perch is compared to the rest of the economy is pretty small. The increases of yellow perch increase the quantities of other variables by the same percentage, but it actually decreases the price of the yellow perch. So just kind of some really preliminary brief results there. We can look at how those changes then are going to go through and what impacts we'll see in the economy. The next model that I want to talk about is the multi-link model. I'm not going to go through necessarily so many of the results, but I just like to talk about, at this point, it's pretty preliminary, but the setup that we have. And so in addition to some of the aspects we had in the single-link model, this one also includes that households consume both non-market and market goods. So before we're just saying, well, people in households buy certain goods. Well, now we're actually saying, well, if you're a household and you like to fish, you go fishing not just so you can bring home a fish, but because you're enjoying that experience. So that's a non-market good. So we're including that in our model setup. Again, we have that additional connection, so we can take the output from our econ model and feed that back into the ecological model. We can compare again those benchmark scenario outcomes, but then we can also compare these outcomes to a single link model and see what the differences might be. And that's the area that I'm going to talk about here next. So comparing the single and multi-link outcomes, the additional feedback between the systems, so again, that idea that humans response is going to impact the ecosystem. We can compare the differences in those outcomes. And so what this is showing is that we have the percent difference in biomass between a single and multi-link model. And so we're showing that the multi-link model predicts larger populations of some species. So when we account for the fact that humans adapt to changing conditions, the amount of walleye, the population of walleye predicted with that, when we consider the adaptation, actually is more than when we don't consider the fact that humans adapt to changing conditions. And the yellow perch is the opposite. So we would actually say that the multi-link model predicts smaller populations of yellow perch over a given time frame than if we don't include that adaptation, that response from people to the changing conditions. And so it's that additional link captures humans adapting. So whether it's fishers saying, well, now it's harder to catch that fish because they're less, I'm going to switch to another species. And so that's what we think is being captured by this additional link between the systems. Again, not so much that I have specific results for the Asian carp invasion because our data is limited to what we have available for us on the U.S. side of things, but these are some of the approaches that we could take to evaluate that for a given scenario, for a given region. And so I think that the big takeaways from this part of it is the linkages. Obviously, we think the linkages between the ecosystem and the economy are important, and how you model those linkages is going to influence what sort of outcomes or impacts you see. And then in modeling those linkages, it is important to consider on the commercial side of things how the fishery is regulated and what the angler recreational experience looks like and how we can best model those to accurately represent human choices and behaviors. So that's what I have for the economic side of things.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So now that leaves us with some time for questions. Let's see if here. So we have a couple questions so far. One of them is, have any Asian carp been found in the U.S. that approach the maximum size and weight? This is referring to Doran's fourth slide.
So this is Ed talking. Actually, no. The answer is no. They have grown, their populations have grown very quickly in the Mississippi River and Illinois River. And they've grown so fast that there's some evidence that they are reduced the prey available, and they have not reached the age or the size that they have been seen elsewhere. They've been introduced all over the world, and the maximum size and weight that Doran reported is the maximum that's been reported in the literature. But in the Illinois River, they've only seen them up to about age 8, and I'm not sure how much they've weighed, but it's certainly less than 40 kilograms, which is about 100 pounds.
Awesome. Another question we have, will the economic model include the issues associated with the negative effect of silver carp jumping on the choice to fish or do recreational boating?
That's something we've definitely talked about and considered. We haven't come up with a way to necessarily include how, getting hit with a silver fish while you're fishing might impact your desire to fish for certain groups, but that is something we've considered. We're trying to figure out how we can better model our recreation side.
Awesome. Another question. Did the models include the nearshore productivity levels, such as in Spring Lake or the mouth of the Muskegon River?
This is Ed again. The different models, specifically the individual-based bioenergetics model and the Atlantis model that Hong Yen talked about, do include productivity levels for the nearshore area. The EcoPath EcoSim model that Doran talked about does not include variability in the space in the area of Lake Erie, for example, or these other lakes. And we recognize that our prediction for Lake Erie, if we focus on just the western basin of Lake Erie, the prediction might actually be different because it has higher productivity level than the rest of the lake.
Excellent. Another question. How do you account for the findings in a recent paper that showed silver carp growing abundantly on detritus? Did the models differentiate between silver and bighead carp accordingly?
Well, when we set up the assumptions in the models for all the models, we did assume that Asian carp can feed on detritus. They can also feed on bacteria and phytoplankton and zooplankton species. The silver carp, we assumed, would eat proportionately more phytoplankton than would bighead carp, which we think will eat proportionally more zooplankton species. But they all can eat those same 4 prey groups: detritus, bacteria, phytoplankton, and zooplankton.
Awesome.
And we ran scenarios where we varied the amount of detritus. Is that right, Tanya?
Yeah, the detritus in the diet.
In the diet, to look at, because we've seen different reports that they feed on more or less detritus depending on what's out there in the environment.
Okay, another question. Have you done any modeling in Lake Superior, or are you not concerned about Asian carp in this system?
No, we are concerned about Lake Superior, and in fact, the productive nearshore area around Duluth and St. Louis estuary, we were funded to first focus on these other lake habitats, and it's taking us time to work through those, but we hope to work on Lake Superior in the future. Our next lake that we're going to collaborate with scientists from Canada and the U.S. is Lake Ontario.
Cool. Another question. The Atlantis model showed the silver carp population growing faster than the bighead carp. This is different than what has been observed in the Illinois River. What drives that in the model? Equal numbers of fish being released at the same location at the same time?
I think those, the major reasons they eat different things. For the silver carp, they mainly focus on the algae and detritus, while the bighead carp eat more on zooplankton. That's the major difference when I put in the model.
Great. One last question. Has there been any ground truthing of the lake's model using similar communities where Asian carp are already well established?
That's a great question. We've been talking to scientists in the Illinois River and the Mississippi River to use one of these models and apply it in that system so we can compare what this model would predict versus what has been observed there. And we have not started that process. We hope to be funded through another source, and that's one of the projects that we could take on. Great idea, and we hope to get to it.
Great. So that's all the time that we have for questions. I just want to thank everyone for listening, and thank you to our speakers, Ed, Doran, Hong-Yan, and Jenny, for taking the time out of your day to speak to us today. We're going to have this webinar posted on our website at www.asiancarp.ca. I'll probably get it up there tomorrow morning, and we have all of our other ones up there as well if anyone's interested. So thanks again, everyone, and stay tuned for some future webinars.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.